Wesley's historic questions were about what to teach, how to teach, and what to do. For this interval of features for the Connectional Table's emerging forum, we will seek to update these questions for our current moment. We will invite energetic conversation that will illumine our identity, which is tied to what and how we teach, our preferred actions, what we do, and our abiding hopes as we envision the future United Methodist Church. Our intent is to generate passion and energy for constructive conversations that help us walk forward together. Today, I am joined by Bishop Gregory Palmer, the Bishop of the West Ohio Annual Conference. Good afternoon, Bishop Palmer.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you, and thanks for this opportunity.
And it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for making the time out of your busy schedule. We're going to start with just kind of talking about some issues around identity and who we are as United Methodists. What are the core principles that you believe shape who we are as United Methodist Christians?
Thanks for that question. I think it's my belief that, and I'm sort of looking over a longer stream of history, so I'm thinking from the beginning till now, and I'm not suggesting that they are different, but I'm leaving openness that they may have evolved, or some things may have gone to the wayside. But I believe that United Methodists and all the streams that form United Methodists have been shaped by a belief that grace is for all, that salvation is extended by God in Christ Jesus in the power of the Holy Spirit for all people everywhere. And secondly, I believe that we've been shaped in terms of principles and values by connection. That's been hugely defining, I believe, from the beginning until now. It doesn't mean there haven't been any stress points. I think that we have held as a core value our ecumenicity, and let me sort of just tease out, the spirit of Mr. Wesley and his notion of Catholic spirit would be, I think, an undergirding theme for him about how we approach the ecumenical and I would say interfaith relationships and work. Fourthly, we are shaped and defined identity-wise by a conviction, and I believe practice, not perfect practice, about engagement in the world and in the communities where we are. And I think that goes to our deepest roots. A contemporary way of putting that might be to say we believe and affirm in contextual ministry. But I want to talk about engagement with our communities and the world. So we might also put the label mission on that. So I think those are four key definers of us.
Well, when you think about those key definers, you talked about grace, you talked about mission and engagement, you talked about evangelism, bringing people to Christ, this outreaching message of the love of God for all people. How does that become real through the ministry of the local church? What do people see United Methodists doing and saying that point to those key identity markers that you mentioned?
I think one of the things that the world outside of United Methodism would see among some of the things I've listed is the care that many, if not most, United Methodist local congregations have in terms of engaging their communities. Now, I don't think it's as even as it could or should be, because there have been periods, and we might be in one of them now, where local congregations have kind of gone into the bunker. They've turned in to say, well, who's going to take care of us? But when we are at our best, and when people that, let's say, are not United Methodists, and maybe not even people of Christian faith or of any particular faith, say, those United Methodists, they do these things. I thrill when I run into someone that is not a United Methodist, that identifies a quality and a characteristic that says we were engaged in the community, in the neighborhood, and in the world. I would say writ large, we see it in our response to huge crises and disaster response, and I would say other crises as well. And so I think that's a plus. I think we've been known across time for being in lots of places, and I want to say particularly in the United States, but underscoring that we're a global church. But that whole analogy that was made several decades ago, that there are as many, if not more, local United Methodist churches as there are United States post offices. I don't think that's quite as true as it is, as it might have been 25 years ago. But presence and identity in those communities are ways in which people have marked us.
Now, you mentioned with local churches that sometimes there's a tendency to turn inward, and that certainly has been an issue that we tried to address in terms of church vitality. How do you feel this pandemic has impacted that?
I think there's been some, let me say, some give and some take on that. When I talk to individual United Methodists and leaders of congregations in West Ohio, I hear extraordinary things, and particularly, but not exclusively, but there's a retired layman in this conference. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was talking with him because he chairs a committee in the annual conference, and we were trying to set up a meeting to, kind of keep in touch about the work of that committee. And he said, well, I can't do it at this time, Bishop, and I can't do it at that time because my wife and I, we have an ongoing commitment of being at the food pantry where we serve people in need. So I said, well, dude, how's that working in the pandemic? I mean, he's mid-70s. He and his wife both. So they hit all of the bells of categories of vulnerability, at least by age, some by health conditions. And he said, we put our masks on, we get our sanitizer, we set up the space differently along with our other volunteer peers, but we're just not backing off of serving the most vulnerable. I want to say that story has been repeated over and over and over and over again in this pandemic. And I'm talking at the volunteer level. I'm not even speaking about the people that have to go to work. Let's say those in the medical community, or people that are first responders that keep showing up. And a part of it is, it's their job, it's their skill set, but it's more that it's their vocation. And they cannot bear to watch people being that vulnerable to this virus. So United Methodists and United Methodist congregations have continued to keep serving, even when they've gone to all online worship. Their giveaway serving, direct service needs ministries are still going, and sometimes that's done ecumenically. That's a great source of pride.
We talk about twin pandemics.
Mm-hmm.
And not just the pandemic of COVID, the pandemic of racism, especially as it's manifested itself in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tell me how you reacted, how you felt when all of the things began to happen around the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others.
Yeah, it was as if, this will be dramatic and violent, but as if an ice pick were being plunged into my body multiple times, because it was happening so close together. And over the last 6 or 8 years, even going back to the incident where George Zimmerman, killed the young man. It's like Black life not only doesn't matter to some people, but when something and someone doesn't matter, it becomes, or they become, expendable. There's a phrase in the book of Job, and I know I'm lifting it out of the text, but there's a place where Job is described as being one with no name in the streets. And I feel that way at times as a person of ebony hue, as a Black man, as an African American here in the United States. And that is said fully in the context of having had a broad opportunity and privilege of serving in a predominantly white institution, though it is incumbent upon me to say not an institution that started off all white or as largely white as it is now in the United States. And I think Methodist historians would concur with that. So it's been hugely painful. The other part of that pain is, I've felt reasonably safe, but I've taken some extra precautions, all of them of a nonviolent nature. And so I don't intend to arm myself in any way. So that's not the intimation here. But, I've watched over time, and this is not new to just the George Floyd assassination era, but, if I happen to go into my bank in the neighborhood where I bank, and I happen to be going in when I'm coming from the gym or on the way to the gym. I've got a sweatsuit on, or even gym shorts and a top, and never been mistreated. Let me be clear. But there's a sort of an almost perfunctory, "Can we help you, sir?" If I go in my suit and tie, much less in my clerical, because it's on for other reasons, they're genuflecting. It's like stumbling over themselves. So that kind of idea that you get treated differently based on your appearance. I am not suggesting that may not happen to other demographics. I'm saying I know it happens to people of color. I know it happens to Black people. Let me be deeply specific. And so the other thing is I worry for my, I've got a 38-year-old son, Cynthia and I. And I shouldn't be worried that if he gets stopped, and rightly so, if his tail light is out or something like that, I want him to have the same opportunity that he gets to go home that night, and that he's he doesn't wake up dead, to paraphrase. So that's the anxiety that many people of color, Black and brown in particular, carry with them, and it's just utterly ridiculous. This is a 400-plus-year-old virus. It is not unknown. It has a name. It appears only to have gone dormant in certain seasons, but it has never been dormant in the history of America pre a constitution and a Declaration of Independence, and even now. That's probably a little more than you wanted, but that's what editing is for.
So help me envision, in all that you've said, and you've said a lot, help me to envision the church's response. What would you hope the church would do? How should the church respond?
My hope is that our church, I think this is true for all churches, but the place where you and I have any influence is among United Methodists, is that we would clear our throats and bring this conversation anew to center stage in the life of the church. It's already center stage in the life of the culture. It does not mean that there are not other important isms and sins of society that need to be addressed concurrently. So there's a huge intersectionality to a lot of this. But people have raised the question, if we had managed in the United Methodist Church, for example, the conversation of race differently, and really followed through on our preachments and our teachings and what's in our book of discipline, might we have been better able to manage other conversations about the isms and phobias that have bedeviled us. Gil Caldwell is one who kept raising that philosophical, theological question. Maybe because we demurred on this, which has been with us from the beginning, we will be in the position of continuing to demur on a clarion call, a distinct bugle sound, that we not only stand for the elimination of racism in all the aspects of our lives. Now, it's one thing to speak at a denominational level, and I'm not suggesting that we've spoken that strongly. But if you look at our book of discipline, there's some good things there. So I want to affirm that. Annual conferences have made some good statements. From time to time, the agencies and the Council of Bishops have done that. But we've not stayed consistently denominationally on point. And so it is no wonder to me that in some communities, in local churches, there is reactivity to, for example, this phrase, Black Lives Matter. I mean, we should all be able to say that without choking on it and without diluting it to then have all these other categories. Of course, all lives matter. It is insane to not be able to bring a focus to where real pain is at a particular time. It does not undermine the mattering of all lives and of other specific demographics. So what local congregations can do and what annual conferences and the denominations should be doing is providing resourcing and equipping, first by keeping the conversation going, secondly, by making strategic systemic decisions that embody what happens in those conversations. And then saying what we say in everything. Every community and every local church can step into this conversation. And we would step into it more effectively if we weren't so segregated in our congregations. But that may be another subject.
That's a whole nother interview. Let me ask you, you mentioned that had we not demurred, and as you say that, I am thinking that you are speaking of the creation of the central jurisdiction. Can you talk about that? Mm-hmm.
So, we talk often of the so-called reunion of 1939. Methodist Protestant, Methodist Episcopal, and Methodist Episcopal South, and what was a huge political compromise to get the union, so to speak, or the reunion. And it was done on the backs of African Americans. But I want to say that when we constitutionalized segregation, understanding that not every Black American United Methodist was in a church, and even a historically Black church that was in the central jurisdiction, but the majority were. That when we constitutionalized it, we codified it, which means it's to get it out took 2/3 or more of a vote. You with me? When we codified it, we actually took a step back. Not that our separations were not themselves a step back from the gospel and from the earliest, best aspirations of the Methodist movement, and so that history, that legacy, is still with us. And in fact, this is my opinion as a United Methodist, that the fact that the jurisdictional lines are still there is a daily reminder to this United Methodist that we are not free of that demon of racialized Methodism, United Methodism, of segregation. And within the borders of those jurisdictions, some of the jurisdictions that most advocated that this is the only way they could come into the so-called reunion, are in some ways still parts of the church that believe they're running things.
And what you're talking about is just the creation of not just the central jurisdictions, but the creation of jurisdictions, period.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
a way to segregate. Could you say more specifically for people who don't know their history, why were jurisdictions created?
So roughly hewn that when the reunion or union was being negotiated, and that conversation sort of got consummated in the late 30s, it was roughly speaking the matter of, would there ever be bishops that looked like me or looked like you, Kennetha, that would end up presiding over Anglo sisters and brothers in certain parts of the church. And it was simply not conceivable for some of our sisters and brothers, meaning our predecessors, that they could conceive that a Black Episcopal leader would be have authority in that way in the life of the church under the Book of Discipline over their lives, their itineration, and their congregations. So in order to, there are all sorts of layers that church historians could tease out, but that would be, I would say, sort of the big rock that fills the jar. How can we make sure that there's not too much mixing and mingling? And if you folks up there want to mix and mingle, it's all right, but don't impose that on us. It's not dissimilar to what happened with the desegregation of segregation and desegregation issues related to public education. I mean, this is a story, a narrative that's been rehearsed over and over again. And again, I apologize if this is too American, but in the U.S. context.
Thank you. That's really helpful. As I think, especially for those who don't know the history in the ways that you do, and you bring such experience and such eloquence to that explanation. So we are at a interesting point in the life of the church as we look forward to a future that we cannot perhaps imagine. So what would you say, as we look forward, what are the priorities that should guide what we do or what we stop doing in the coming years? As we think about this church that we may have, that may be unfolding before our eyes, what are the priorities that guide what we do, but also what we stop doing as we go forward?
Fabulous question, and let me just take aim at it a little bit. I think we ought to continue to be guided by our best theological and doctrinal instincts. So let me use the large category of grace and salvation extended to all, and that's all very can be articulated in a variety of ways. But I don't think we need to walk away from that at all. I think in terms of grace and sanctifying grace, while we may need to find contemporary ways to talk about it, particularly with people that haven't been nurtured in the stories of the Bible in the Christian tradition, let alone in the Wesleyan way and the United Methodist tradition. I don't think we need to walk away from the notion that we aspire and we lean into being made perfect in love in this life. So holiness and sanctification. But what does that look like individually and corporately? So serious theological and doctrinal commitments. Secondly, I think we must be shaped by the instinct to go into the world and get out of the bunker. We've been told for a long time, and I want to say at least 40 or 50 years, that we've got to get out of the precinct of our church buildings and into the world. One of the things that COVID has done, for example, because everybody's had to go to online, and more people have access to that. In some ways, some congregations are more in the world, at least from the standpoint of proclamation and worship, than they have been or have conceived of themselves as being. It simply has not been reasonable for a church to say, well, we just can't do that. We're too old, or we're too this, or to that, not to that. So, but we've got to be the people that go into the world with the gospel in word and in deed. So here's the third thing. I believe that one of our commitments has been, and I think this is biblical, and I believe that it is Wesleyan, but these are my words, that an evangelistic faith, an evangelical faith, so small e, the capital E politicizes it, so a small e, and a prophetic / social witness. We must be the church, and we have been at our best moments, where there is no daylight between those. When we let daylight between, and we have people in our pews saying, and I, have this all the time. Well, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I believe, well, I'm a social witness. Seriously, no. If you're a Christian and you are continuing to be shaped by the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and by the gospel of Jesus Christ, I don't believe any warrant has been given to us in Scripture and in the best moments in all of church history for there to be daylight between those. They go together. And there are some traditions that have kept that alive in profound ways. One of them is the so-called historic Black church tradition. A strong evangelistic preaching with more than hints of social witness, altar calls where people are invited to discipleship and commitment. And oh, by the way, when we leave here today, we're going down to picket the so-and-so. Now, I'm using images out of some decades that have gone by. There's no daylight between those. And we got to get over ourselves and stop choking on that. I think that's the best part of our witness, when we can see where those come together and where the one informs the other. The grounding for doing this into the world informs the other. So let me illustrate very quickly. There's probably not 10% of United Methodist congregations that are not engaged in some form of direct service delivery to people in deep need, let's say around food insecurity, etc. But there would be some robust conversations, if not arguments, about whether or not we should be involved in public policy about food stamps. And I'm saying, no, it's both and. We got to get in that conversation and stay in it. And I mean, we are through our agencies, but we got to do it at the state and local levels as well.
And at the local church level as well.
At the local church level, yeah. And there are signs of that. I mean, you look at the work that happens, United Methodist women, the things they advocate around their letter writing, how they organize, and their strength is the local units. They don't let that daylight come. And so we need to find more examples of when that has shown us at our best.
You mentioned the Black church. Mm-hmm. What does the Black church have to teach us all of this?
Well, I've described it a bit, not letting that daylight in when we've been at our best. But I don't want to paint the Black church as a panacea because we've been... I think Black congregations have gotten as much compromised by the culture as any congregations. I'm speaking, let me say again, here in a U.S. context. But there are some that still have that vibrant witness where those streams come together. And I think that needs to be captured. Professor Eddie Glaude at Princeton University, about a decade ago, wrote an essay for which he was excoriated by some people, where he announced in this essay, the Black church is dead. And you have to actually read the essay. And he says, essentially, dead if we continue to be lost in our connection to communities. And there was a whole litany of things that he laid out in this short, but I think poignant essay. So it was really a wake-up call kind of essay. And I think I've used that, quotation generously and said, your church is dead if you're disconnected from your community. If you do not know who your neighbors are, if you're a drive-in congregation only, there's nothing morally wrong driving across zip codes to go to a church service. So that's not my shtick. But if where that church is planted, you do not know your neighbors and you are not in relationship with them in behalf of the church and in behalf of your Christian faith and your love and witness for Jesus Christ, you're going to soon be a dead Christian, and you're going to soon be a part of a dead church if your ilk is multiplied. I know those may sound like hyperbolic statements. It doesn't take that much to sap the gospel energy out of a church. And we just sort of drift into it. And it comes from taking care of ourselves more than caring about the world around us. It's maintaining the chapel mentality. We just want to stay open so we can bury a few more people, and then we'll quietly close. Man, that's not a mission. That's not a mission. We got a mission to join God in the redemption of the whole world and participating in the power of the Holy Spirit in bringing about new creation. I mean, God is the primary actor, and God invites us to be God's partners in that work. So I want to say, this is a little bit off point. I say to every congregation, small or large, you already at this moment have everything you need to take the next faithful step in your witness and in your discipleship. Now, I don't care if you got 10 folks or if you got 1,000 folks. Now, if you stay at this, your aim doesn't have to be to get to a certain number. Your aim has to be at faithfulness and at helping people to understand what it means to be a disciple. And when we are faithful, vibrant disciples, we're actually, let me kind of play with Paul a little bit. We offer a sweet aroma. It becomes inviting and compelling. And every Christian can do that. Every United Methodist can do that. Every congregation can do that, but they've got to want to do it.
You were involved, I believe it was in 2012, and even before 2012, 2008 on, in the call to action. And what did you learn from that process? What about that process was right on? What about that process would you do differently?
I was involved in it, and it continues to bless me. Obviously, I was a little disappointed when some of the stuff didn't go forward legislatively, though let me say it was affirmed and then overturned according to our processes and rules. So no bad people. Disagreement doesn't mean that people are bad, and it didn't mean that as it came forward that it didn't have flaws. My idea in being a part of bringing legislation forward is, can we perfect this and make it better? And that's a challenge in an assembly of somewhere between 850 and 1,000 people, because everybody's got an image of perfection in their own mind. And so sometimes we've got to figure out, is perfection the enemy of the good? But I thought we took some steps forward in the conversation. And what I've seen over time out of what we learned is that annual conferences were able to integrate some of those learnings around some of the priorities and values and goals driven by data into the life of an annual conference, because nothing prohibited annual conferences from doing that. But the general conference was overturned in its majority vote on most of that. I think structurally, we offered something that was meaningful, not perfect, but we were, I think, a little, at the end of the day, a little intimidated, and I'm saying we as a denomination, if we could really make that much change. In some ways, we've tried to integrate the spirit of those changes without legislating them. And not perfectly, but I've seen that a bent to greater collaboration, to some more streamlining, to get economies of scale. And it was never an anti-institutional initiative, nor an anti-agency initiative, but it was an initiative to say, how do we get the brightest light shone on the arena? And we were saying that that was the local church, where discipling of people really happens. That doesn't mean that the work that happens at adjudicatory and denominational levels lacks importance, but it was a way of shifting where we were putting the searchlight and the emphasis. And I think to some degree, I've seen some of that happen. So again, I was a little disappointed, but nothing prohibited us from embracing a lot of that in annual conferences. So I think we did good work, and I think there are some things that we still have to be perfected. One of them is we still have not, we get really close, but we still, this whole matter of, let's say, guaranteed appointment, we're still tepid about that. And I want to say for any of us, and I'm an elder in the church, you're an elder in the church, we're serving in different roles. I have a friend who's a laywoman in a conference that I don't serve, but I knew her as a student, and she was in a congregation I served as a student pastor. And she said to me in 2012, she said, Rev, she still calls me Rev. She said, in what universe does anybody have a guaranteed job? Now, she's a preacher fan. She's a preacher supporter. And she worked in the corporate world until she retired. She said that just doesn't make any sense anymore. and her plan, she was a manager for a major telecommunications company. And she said, in what universe? And so we have a lot of protectionism in the United Methodist Church. And the largest category of protectionism is around those of us that are clergy. And I think it's gonna change.
We've talked a lot about the church in the United States. We've talked about the local church. We've talked about theological emphases looking forward. Tell me what your thoughts are around a worldwide denomination trying to find its way at a time where we're struggling with what connectionalism really means and would look like in a worldwide denomination in which the U.S. is perhaps not the center.
Let me say that while 90% of my illustrations, if not more, have been U.S.-centric, because it's what I know best, I believe that our intention and aspiration to be an effective and fruitful global church is the right aspiration and emphasis. What I've said about teaching and doctrine, I would say that across the whole. So those things about grace for all, engagement with context and community, the intent on my part was that's true no matter where we are as United Methodists. And we as what has been a U.S.-centric church need to, one of the questions that is harder for us to ask is, what is it that we have to learn all around the church from each other? And because there's been so much focus on the U.S. When we've been in global gatherings, et cetera, where are the places where we need to spend less time talking and more time listening to sisters and brothers that are serving in other parts of the world? And where do we begin to do a kind of a co-missioning, and I want to say a real back and forth of missioning one another? See, we have this whole multi-century history of sending people from the United States and Europe into other places in the so-called third or developing world. We need to be missioned in the United States, for example. Europe needs to be remissioned, I humbly say to my European sisters and brothers. What do we have to learn from our sisters and brothers in Africa, in the Philippines, and I would say in Latin America? And while those are mostly affiliated autonomous churches, which is a whole nother conversation, there is so much because of global migration that we need to be learning. If nothing else, global migration and immigration matters are reasons why we need to stay as a global church and learn from one another. However, or in addition to that, there needs to be space specific to do work in those larger national or continental contexts. And I want to say both because Africa is a continent, not one nation. So what's good in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, may not be as applicable in countries of West Africa. So it's both national and continental context, and certainly that's true in Europe. So we need some air and some space, but I don't want it to be just that Americans need air and space to maneuver. Because then that quickly, if we're going to be brutally and as well as truthfully honest, narrows things pretty much to one or two subject matters. I think everybody needs some of that space. Now, how we define that in terms of polity, that's where we're stuck. That's where we're stuck. And I do think we have some examples in history of varying movements that, you don't cease to be a Jew, for example, in our context in America, because you're not a Orthodox Jew, but you're Reformed and conservative. I'm not suggesting that they may not have jokes about one another and caricatures, but you don't cease to be, you don't cease in your Jewishness. I think there are other examples. If you look at some of the streams of traditions around Amish and Mennonite sisters and brothers. There are shadings and nuances around that where people have been given space, but their identity is not taken. Well, you're not one, and that's what I fear, that when we get stuck on a couple of places, we want to say, well, if you do that, you're not a real United Methodist. Well, I think we ought to let there be a little more air and space than that. I think there are some things, because we're not consistent. We're not consistent. You can be a United Methodist and believe any doggone thing you want in spite of our teaching in the social principles, for example, on the death penalty. So you can be strongly anti-abortion and as a United Methodist and find a very comfortable space, and you can be virulently in favor of execution of other human beings. So I'm saying, well, we actually practically have already learned how to give each other room, and by that I mean we don't discount people if they don't toe to certain things that we subscribe to. So I think there ought to be some things that you have to subscribe to be a United Methodist. Let me be clear. I think we ought to work at that list being clearer, sharper, and shorter.
Mm-hmm. So Bishop, thank you. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you would want to share?
Absolutely not. You've allowed me to comment freely along the way, and so I'm going to stand down, and please accept my gratitude for you, for your ministry, the ministry of the Connectional Table, and this opportunity.
Thank you so much. This has been a joy. Thank you.